My daughter Zoe walked a few steps ahead of me, her small hands gripping the edges of her lunch tray like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her head hung low, her shoulders curved inward like she was trying to disappear. Lately, she always moved like that, quiet, cautious, as if she expected the world to bite. She passed a cluster of kids, leaning against the lockers, laughing too loudly. One boy nudged another and whispered something. Then I heard it, a short, cruel laugh. I looked up. That's when I saw it. Taped to the back of her sweatshirt was a crumpled piece of paper curling at the corners. Thick black marker screamed across it, "Loser with no dad." My chest seized. I froze my breath, catching mid-inhale. Those 5 words hit me like a punch, sharp and merciless. I stood rooted in that hallway, eyes locked on my baby girl, as she kept walking, completely unaware of the humiliation stuck to her back. Not a single person stopped her. Not a teacher, not a friend, not even the janitor sweeping the hall. Just this eerie, complicit silence. That hateful sign hung there like a cruel badge, and I could do nothing but watch, stomach-churning, heartbreaking. Her name is Zoe Carter. She's 11 years old with a head full of big ideas and a knack for drawing superheroes who wear mismatched socks and talk to animals. She loves twisting her hair into crooked pigtails because, as she tells me, symmetry is for robots. For the past few weeks, she's been sitting alone in the lunchroom, sketching on napkins instead of talking to anyone. I didn't know why until today. Because today, something unexpected happened. A man in a crisp military uniform stepped into that cafeteria. The room didn't go quiet right away, but something shifted. Conversations softened, trays clattered a little less, and then he marched straight to the table where Zoe sat by herself. Every step echoed. When he reached her, he said in a voice that carried across the entire cafeteria, calm and sure, "I'm her father, and I have something to say." That was the moment everything changed. Zoe used to be the wildest, noisiest spirit in our home. At dinner, she'd talk with her mouth full, interrupt her own stories to add more details, laugh so hard she'd nearly spit her drink out and wave her arms like she was conducting a symphony made of giggles. She'd draw little cartoons on napkins and stick them all over the fridge, announcing each one like it had just won a Pulitzer. One time, she created a whole comic strip about a pink flamingo named Captain Beaks, who saved Earth from a giant garbage octopus. She even made a theme song for him and sang it at bedtime. That was Zoe, bold, quirky, proud of being the oddball. But then things started to shift. It began subtly, a half-finished sketchbook tossed under her bed. Characters once drawn with loving detail now scribbled over in red ink. She stopped coming into the kitchen after school, started answering fine to every question. And she'd vanish into her room until dinner, like a ghost in her own home. I told myself it was just a phase, maybe the beginning of puberty or stress from school. But deep down, I knew better. Her light, once so bright it filled every corner of our small house, had dimmed, and I didn't know how to relight it. I'm Rachel Carter. I'm 32 and I juggle a morning shift at the local diner with stocking shelves 3 nights a week at the supermarket. I've raised Zoe on my own since the day she came into this world. Her father, David, was already deployed when I found out I was pregnant. He missed everything: her first cry, her first steps, her first words. The first time she said, "Mama," I smiled. The first time she asked why she didn't say Dada. I cried in the laundry room. I used to tell her, "Daddy's a soldier. He's far away helping people. But he loves you so much." I repeated it like a prayer, like saying it. Enough times might make it true. But eventually the words started to taste like lies. When David came back stateside a few years ago, we tried to patch things up to create something like a family. But war does something to people. It leaves dents you can't always see. He was quieter, tenser, like the noise in his head never stopped. He was kind but distant, like he was stuck between 2 worlds, ours and whatever battlefield still echoed inside him. We didn't argue. We didn't fall apart with screaming matches or slammed doors. We just faded, drifted, separated without ever saying the words. I told myself Zoe was better off without that version of him. I never told her everything. I thought I was shielding her from pain, from rejection, from a father who couldn't be what she deserved. But now I realize I was also protecting myself from guilt, from admitting I might have made the wrong call. My dad, Frank Thompson, tried to fill the space David left behind. He's tough Vietnam vet, talks like gravel and walks like a soldier even in slippers. But when it comes to Zoe, he turns to mush. He's the one who ran beside her as she wobbled on her first bike, the one who let her cover his bald head in sparkly stickers one Christmas. He calls her Lightning Bug. She lights up around him, or she used to. But even Grandpa Frank couldn't reach her lately. She was floating farther and farther out, and I didn't know how to swim after her, not until last week. It was a Wednesday. Zoe had a stomach bug, so I went to pick her up early from school. She didn't know I was coming. I walked in just before lunch thinking I'd catch her before the bell. That's when I saw her, alone, walking toward the cafeteria, hunched over quiet, and that sign taped to her back like a cruel joke. It shattered something inside me. Later that afternoon, I peeled the paper off her sweatshirt and sat with her on our old living room couch. I asked her gently, has this happened before? She didn't speak, just gave a slow, almost invisible nod. I pushed a little, asking, do you know who did it? She still didn't look at me, but after a beat, she whispered Kyle, and Jason, and Brett. I felt my heart clench. Why didn't you tell me, baby? I asked, trying not to sound desperate. She didn't answer. So I asked the one question I had dreaded most. Do you wish your dad were here? She looked up, and for the first time in weeks, tears welled in her eyes, not just sadness, but something deeper, a kind of aching hope. Maybe they wouldn't say those things, if he was. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we got here. Thinking about all the truths I kept locked away, the things I thought she didn't need to know. The next morning, while she still slept, I pulled out an old phone number written on a crumpled receipt, faded and nearly forgotten. I stared at it for what felt like forever. Then, with fingers trembling, I hit call. When he answered, I didn't say hello. I just said the words that cracked something open inside both of us. She needs you. I had convinced myself, naively perhaps, that making that call would somehow sew the wounds shut, that David's voice, even after all these years, could mend what had unraveled inside Zoe. I clung to the fragile hope that a father's presence, even an estranged one, might fill the aching space I'd never been able to reach. But life rarely bows to wishful thinking. Healing, I was learning, isn't instant. It doesn't come wrapped in easy moments or dramatic reunions. Sometimes it claws through worse before it dares to reach better. 2 days later, my phone buzzed during the lull between breakfast rushes at the diner. I recognized the school's number, and something cold threaded down my spine even before I answered. It was the assistant principal, Ms. Langston, her voice tight and carefully measured, like someone who'd delivered bad news too often to flinch anymore. There was an incident during lunch. She began, her tone clipped and administrative. Zoe locked herself in the bathroom. She's not physically hurt, but she's extremely upset. We believe it's connected to the bullying you and I discussed last week. That word bullying sank into my stomach like a stone. The fluorescent lights above me flickered as the blood rushed from my face. I didn't ask questions. I just yanked off my apron, mumbled something incoherent to the line cook, and ran. My tires screeched, leaving the parking lot. I don't remember the drive, just my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel and the rhythmic thudding of panic in my ears. When I arrived, Zoe was already out of the stall, hunched on the nurse's cot knees, drawn tight to her chest like she was trying to fold herself out of existence. Her eyes were swollen, red-rimmed lashes, clumped with the remnants of dried tears. Her face was pale, not with illness, but with the raw sting of humiliation, and she wouldn't meet my gaze. Not even when I knelt beside her and whispered her name. Ms. Langston handed me a crumpled piece of paper rescued from the floor near the lunch tables. This one was worse than the last. The same cruel handwriting screamed, "Loser with no dad. Keep walking, freak." My fingers trembled. My vision blurred around the edges. Rage and helplessness surged in equal, suffocating waves. This isn't the first, she admitted. It's been ongoing. We've spoken to the students involved. We've been monitoring the situation closely. The bureaucratic, rehearsed calm in her voice made me want to scream. Monitoring spoken to my daughter had been drowning in silence and cruelty, and all they'd done was watch from the shore. I glanced at Zoe. She hadn't moved. Her arms were looped around her knees like armor, her gaze fixed on the floor tiles. She wasn't just hurt. She was gutted. And I, her mother, was just now seeing the depth of her undoing. At home, I tried to build a bridge across the wreckage. I made her tea, the kind she liked, with honey and a splash of milk, and sat gently on the edge of her bed, hoping the familiar weight might ground her. I asked questions, dozens of them, softly, tenderly, trying to thread my voice through the haze. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. She didn't look at me. Her fingers picked absently at the hem of her blanket, unraveling a thread. "I thought if I ignored it, they'd stop," she said at last, her voice barely audible. But they didn't. "Why you?" I asked, my own voice cracking. A small shrug, then quietly, painfully, because I'm weird. Because I draw, because I don't talk much, because I don't have a dad. There it was, the truth spoken so simply it split me in two. She stared at the wall as she added, "They said he left because I messed up." The sentence hit like a car crash. All the carefully layered lies, the gentle silences I'd wrapped around our family like gauze, had only left her more exposed. I thought I was shielding her from pain when all I'd done was leave her defenseless. I pulled her into my arms, and this time, miraculously, she didn't pull away. Her small body trembled against mine, and I held on as if I could press my love deep enough to erase everything they had said. That night, I called my father Frank. He didn't ask for details, didn't need to. I told him simply, I need her to know she's not alone. I need her to feel like she matters. I need her to feel seen. There was a brief pause. Then his gravel-thick voice said, "You still have David's number." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah." "Then call him." "I did," I said, exhaling. He said he'd think about it. Frank let out a grunt that sounded half like disapproval, half like hope wrapped in frustration. Then he'd better do more than think. That night stretched like a thread pulled taut, the kind that snaps under its own tension. Neither Zoe nor I slept. I could hear her pacing softly across her bedroom floor, deliberately avoiding the creaky plank near her window, like she used to when she was little. By morning, she looked like the storm had passed, but not without damage. Her face was calmer, quieter, but her eyes held something that made me ache, a readiness for disappointment. At school drop-off, she paused with one hand on the door handle. "Mom," she said softly. "Yeah, sweetie? What if he doesn't come? I didn't try to paint sunshine where there might be none." "Then we'll face that too. Together." I reached over and squeezed her hand. She gave the faintest nod, then stepped out, her shoulders still low, but maybe, just maybe, less burdened. Later that afternoon, as I folded a load of laundry I hadn't had the heart to finish earlier, my phone buzzed. One message, 4 words. "Tell me when and where." For the first time in months, something uncurled inside me, small and cautious but alive. Hope. It was fragile, a single flame in the dark, but it was real. And that hope I knew was about to walk into a cafeteria wearing boots that echoed like thunder. I didn't know what to expect. David had always been a quiet man, even before the war. Stoic, steady. He spoke like someone who measured every word before giving it breath. But there used to be warmth in his silence, a steadiness that held you even when he wasn't holding you. That warmth had cooled. His third tour took something I couldn't name and never gave it back. When he returned, he was here, but hollowed, kind, yes, but distant, like a man still stuck in a place no one else could see. We hadn't spoken in over 3 years, not out of hate, but because the silence between us had become a thing we didn't know how to navigate anymore. But now that silence had cracked. I texted him Friday, 12:15 p.m., school cafeteria, then added, "You don't have to wear your uniform." He didn't reply. I didn't tell Zoe. I couldn't bear the idea of her counting the hours just to be disappointed. Instead, I said I'd try to visit during lunch and bring her something special. She nodded. No questions, no expectations. She didn't smile, but she didn't retreat either. That in its own way was a step forward. Thursday night sleep evaded me again. My mind spun with possibilities. What if he showed up and made it worse? What if he didn't come at all? I thought about Zoe and all the weight she'd carried in silence. I thought about the boys, Kyle, Jason, Brett, and how small someone must feel to need to shrink others just to feel tall. Morning came with gray skies and a chill in the air. Zoe wore her purple hoodie sleeves frayed from years of wear. As she crunched her cereal, I braided her hair slowly, the way she liked 2 uneven plaits on purpose. She didn't ask about David. She'd stopped asking long ago. But just before she opened the car door, she glanced back and whispered, "Thanks for trying, Mom." She closed the car door without another word, the click of it echoing louder than it should have in the morning stillness. I sat there motionless, hands resting on the steering wheel, my breath caught between heartbeats. For one long, suspended minute, I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I just sat held in the silence of all the things I couldn't fix, staring through the windshield, as Zoe's figure, small and steady, disappeared through the double doors of the school. It was nearly noon when I returned. The sky hung gray and low, a sheet of dull light pressing against the glass as I stood in front of the school's side entrance. My hands gripped a brown paper lunch bag, her name Zoe, written in thick black Sharpie across the front, the letters slightly smudged where my fingers had trembled. The hallway beyond the door hummed with the distant roar of adolescent sneakers squeaking against linoleum, bursts of laughter, the unmistakable clang of cafeteria trays. A teacher I vaguely recognized from orientation glanced up, then gave me a quick nod, ushering me in with quiet efficiency. The moment I stepped into the cafeteria, the noise surged around me, a storm of energy, chaotic, bright, and entirely oblivious to what was about to happen. The scent of overcooked pizza and sour milk clung to the air. My eyes scanned the tables, searching, knowing where she'd be. And then the doors behind me opened with the unmistakable sound of authority. I turned. He was taller than I remembered. Broader, too. His frame filled the doorway like punctuation at the end of a long-forgotten sentence. His face had aged, lined with quiet grief perhaps, or just time, but his presence remained unmistakable. David wore his uniform like armor, sharp creases, polished boots, and ribbons that told stories he'd never had the words to share. The silence around him was immediate and involuntary. His steps struck the tile in clean, deliberate rhythm. His eyes moved over the sea of faces, not looking for me. He didn't need to. He was already walking to her. There she was, Zoe. Alone at the same table as always, legs swinging idly beneath the bench, her sandwich untouched on its wax paper, her fingers dancing across the corner of a napkin, sketching quietly, lost in whatever world she was trying to build in the absence of warmth. The noise in the room began to taper subtly at first, like the volume had been dialed down in slow motion. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. It was a hush, born not of fear, but of something older, recognition perhaps, or awe. David reached her table. He stopped. She looked up, her eyes locked on him for a heartbeat, confused, startled. Recognition wasn't immediate. It had been years after all, but when it hit, her mouth opened slightly, one hand rising to cover her lips as though trying to catch the moment before it slipped away. She looked across the room to me, eyes wide, questioning. David didn't kneel. He didn't cry. He simply placed a firm, gentle hand on her shoulder and spoke loud enough for the room to hear his voice steady his tone without tremor. "I'm her father." Heads turned. A wave of whispers rushed through the cafeteria like wind through dry grass. Still, David stood anchored in the eye of it all, unflinching. "I've heard the things some of you have been saying," he continued, turning, slightly scanning the students without naming names, but ensuring every ear caught his words. "That she's a loser. That she doesn't have a dad. That she isn't worth sitting with." A hush fell heavier now, absolute. "Well, I'm here, and I'm her dad. And let me make this clear, my daughter is not a loser. She's stronger than any bully in this room. She's endured more pain and stood taller through it than most of you could imagine. And if anyone here still has a problem with her, then that problem includes me." There was a pause, a vacuum of sound where even the air seemed to hold its breath. Zoe's eyes brimmed, but this time the tears didn't fall from humiliation. These were tears of astonishment, of recognition, of being seen. David opened the bag I had packed that morning, pulled out her peanut butter sandwich, the slices of apple, and the folded note I had scribbled before the sun rose. "You're magic. Don't forget it." He slid them gently toward her and sat across from her, his movements quiet and intentional as though this were just any other Friday. The spell in the cafeteria didn't break all at once. A few kids resumed chewing. A fork clinked against a tray. A teacher shifted in her chair. But something beneath the surface had shifted permanently. David hadn't just arrived. He had appeared not as a distant shadow, not as a concept Zoe had to explain, but as a father who stood quite literally between her and the cruelty of the world. For the first few minutes, Zoe said nothing. She watched him as if trying to memorize him with her eyes, afraid that if she blinked too long, he might disappear. He looked back, his hands slightly trembling as he unfolded her juice box and pierced the straw through the foil top. Finally, she whispered, her voice fragile as parchment. Is it really you? He nodded. Yeah, it's me. Up close, he looked older than I remembered, his once dark hair streaked with silver, his jaw a little more weathered, the lines around his eyes deeper. But there was clarity in his gaze, a kind of resolve I hadn't seen in years. Why now? She asked, not as a challenge, but with the aching vulnerability of a child whose silence had been loud for far too long. He didn't flinch. Because I should have come sooner. I thought I wasn't good enough to be your dad. I thought staying away would protect you from who I'd become. But I was wrong. Not being here hurt you more than anything else ever could. She looked down at the table, tracing the napkin's edge with one finger. Her voice came barely above a breath. They said you left because I was too weird. His jaw tightened, and though his voice remained calm, there was fire beneath the words. Sweetheart, you are not too weird. You're incredible. You're smart and funny and wild in all the best ways. I didn't leave because of you. I left because I didn't know how to face myself. But I'm here now. And if you'll let me, I'm staying. She blinked as if trying to make room in her heart for something long forgotten. Then, without warning, she stood. The entire cafeteria watched, some openly, others through stolen glances. She walked around the table slowly, her shoes barely making a sound on the tile. He didn't rise, perhaps afraid any sudden motion might startle her back into retreat. She paused in front of him, and then she leaned in and wrapped her arms around his neck. David closed his eyes. His arms went around her in return, fierce and trembling, like he was clutching the only thing anchoring him to the earth. A breath caught in the room, a shared exhale from dozens of lungs. From one table, a soft gasp. From another, a teacher discreetly wiped her eyes. Even Mr. Grady, the perpetually grumpy lunch monitor with a weathered clipboard and decades of apathy, simply nodded once, slow and reverent, like a man witnessing a miracle. And then quietly something else shifted. From the table nearest to where Zoe and David now sat, one of the boys, Kyle, stood up. His tray clattered awkwardly, the clink of metal against plastic, unnaturally loud in the subdued cafeteria. He didn't look up, didn't offer excuses or explanations. Red crept up his cheeks, blotching across his face as he walked past them with his eyes glued to the floor, his silence louder than any apology could have been. Behind him, Jason muttered something under his breath, muffled, defensive, cowardly. A teacher, sharp-eyed and alert, raised a warning finger. No one laughed, because no one could. Not anymore. The moment, raw and unfiltered, had stripped everything down to its barest truth. It wasn't just about cruel jokes or whispered taunts in hallways. It wasn't about shame or schoolyard rumors. It was about a girl who had vanished behind layers of hurt, and a man once distant, now whole, who had stepped into that void and said, I see you. David rose slowly, one arm still curled protectively around Zoe's small shoulders, his posture speaking as loudly as his words had moments earlier. Together they crossed the room one step at a time until they reached me. My pulse pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears, as if my heart had taken up residence in my throat. She's brave, he said, voice low but certain. I nodded, unable to speak for a second. She gets it from both of us. And we walked out together, the three of us. Not as a perfect family, not as a storybook reunion, but as something far more honest, survivors of silence choosing a new beginning. Zoe didn't say much during the ride home. The car hummed along the familiar streets, quiet but not tense. There was something settling in the silence, something soft and safe. As we pulled into the driveway, she leaned forward from the back seat. Her voice, barely a whisper, reached me like sunlight through curtains. You really called him? I nodded once. She reached out, then her small arms wrapping around me in a hug so full it emptied me. Thank you, she breathed into my shoulder. That night we had dinner at home, something that used to be routine, now felt like a celebration. Frank was already seated at the table when we walked in, his face lighting up in the way only grandfathers can. David joined us without hesitation. The two men, so different in years, yet bound by service and scars, slipped into conversation easily. They spoke of helicopters and field rations, of distant sands and sleepless nights, while Zoe watched, eyes wide, her fork forgotten halfway to her mouth. She laughed deep and unrestrained, and it filled the room like music. I hadn't realized how much I missed that sound, or how much I had needed it. The next morning, Zoe padded into the kitchen in her Captain Beek's hoodie, the one she hadn't touched in nearly half a year. She poured cereal without a word, but the air had changed. The heaviness that once hovered around her like fog had begun to lift. She looked lighter, like someone who had finally exhaled after holding her breath for far too long. David had taken the couch for the night, not because we asked him to, but because he didn't want to presume, didn't want to rush the fragile rhythm we were finding again. That morning, he moved quietly in the kitchen, making scrambled eggs that didn't turn to rubber, serving Zoe with a cautious smile. He asked questions, not just the obligatory ones, but real ones. About her drawings, her comic characters, the way she imagined her worlds. Later that day, Zoe showed him a sketch still smudged with graphite, the lines raw and alive. A girl stood tall in a suit of armor, a lightning bolt clutched in one hand, a sketch pad in the other. She's not a superhero, Zoe explained, her voice steady. Her name's Commander Echo. She's just a girl who got tired of pretending to be invisible. David didn't respond right away. He looked at the drawing, like it was a sacred text, like he was being handed something precious he didn't yet deserve. Then he asked quietly, "Can I keep it?" That weekend, something extraordinary happened. Zoe didn't eat lunch alone. Word had traveled. By Monday, students who had never noticed her before greeted her in the halls. A few even joined her at her usual table. It wasn't a miracle cure. Bullies don't vanish overnight. But something inside her and around her had changed. The shame had fractured. The silence had cracked. She stood a little straighter. She made eye contact. She raised her hand in class and answered a question in a voice that didn't tremble. And as I watched her, I realized something inside me was shifting too. For so long I had worn strength like armor, believing I had to carry everything alone. But strength, I now saw, wasn't always about solitude. Letting David back into Zoe's life hadn't been weakness. It had been love, real, raw, messy love. And it wasn't about the image of a father at the table. It was about Zoe learning finally that she was not something to be hidden or pitied, that her silence was not emptiness, that her strangeness was not a flaw. It was in fact her armor. A week later, she came home holding a permission slip, her eyes uncertain. "They want me to speak? At the school assembly," she said. I blinked, stunned. "Speak, you mean, like on stage?" She shrugged. "They were looking for volunteers to talk about bullying. I figured I've got something to say." I wanted to cry. I didn't. I just signed the paper. The auditorium was packed the day of the assembly. Teachers, students, parents. David sat beside me, dressed in jeans and a plain button-down, his hands clenched in his lap. His jaw was tight, his back straight, but his eyes never left the stage. And then Zoe stepped into the spotlight. She wore her Commander Echo hoodie. No script, just a folded piece of paper in her hand, more talisman than speech. She took a breath and leaned into the microphone. "My name is Zoe Carter," she said. "And last month, someone taped a sign to my back. It said, 'Loser with no dad.' And for a while, I believed it. The room held its breath, but then someone showed up. And it wasn't just about having a dad again. It was about realizing I'm not what they said I was. I'm not a loser, I'm not broken, and I'm not alone." She glanced toward David, then at me. "And maybe there's someone out there who feels like they don't belong, who thinks their story isn't good enough, or normal enough, or strong enough. If that's you, I just want to say, don't change who you are to be loved. You don't need to be louder or cooler or less strange. You just need someone to see you." The applause was a slow build, like a storm rolling in quiet at first, then undeniable. It rose like a wave, cresting with cheers and hand claps, and the rustle of people standing to honor the courage of a girl who once felt invisible. And she smiled, not a small, uncertain smile, but a wide, radiant one, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. That night she told a joke at dinner that made Frank snort iced tea through his nose. David nearly fell out of his chair laughing. And I watched them all, my daughter, my father, the man I once let go, and felt something bloom deep inside me. We weren't broken. We were just unfinished. And now at last we were writing the next chapter together. If this story speaks to something in you, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or had to carry burdens too heavy for your age, know this. You are not alone. And your worth isn't defined by what others say behind your back. It's defined by your courage to keep going, to speak up, and to show up for yourself and for others. If this story moved, you consider liking the video so more people can discover it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your story. And if you want to hear more true emotional stories that matter, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply show up.